There is a well-known saying about one of my very favorite destinations in the world, Las Vegas. And the well-known saying, which is an advertising slogan, but the hallmark of a good slogan is that it's well-known. You can summon it to mind almost immediately. It says, "What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas." Of course, we know the subtext to that is that Vegas is a playground, an adult playground where all kinds of things can take place. It's a vacation spot, of course. But of course, the whole point of it is for people to be able to go to Las Vegas and go back and tell their families and friends just how wonderful the place was and how much they enjoy it, as so many millions of people do, although at the moment, even Las Vegas is shuttered in the middle of all of this terrible pandemic that we're experiencing. And so the phrase, though, "what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas," also sort of calls to mind how we tend to hold things to ourselves, that we don't tell them to others. That's a good setup for today's well-known story of two apostles, Cleopas and the other one unnamed, who are making a 7-mile walk from Jerusalem to Emmaus. This is on the morning of the resurrection, the first day of the week, as it says. And as they're journeying and discussing with each other all the sensational things that have happened in those last 3 days, a stranger comes alongside them who they do not recognize. We're told immediately that it's Jesus, but they do not recognize him, even though they had been with him for the last 3 years. And then as the stranger comes upon them and he asks, "What is it that you're talking about?" They seem incredulous. Doesn't everyone in Jerusalem know all of the things that have happened, particularly the crucifixion of Jesus on Good Friday, his burial in the tomb later on, just before Friday evening? And then, of course, they add this vision of angels that rather surprisingly have come to the women early that particular morning. And then they run to tell the disciples that Jesus has risen. And then the disciples go themselves, as we hear in this account, but they do not see him. You see, all of those things are reported by them to this stranger. And then they ask what's got to be the world's most ironic question. They ask Jesus himself, "Do you not know of the things that have happened these past 3 days?" The one celestial being that knows everything, they ask him this question. As the journey continues, remember they've got 7 miles to traverse, and at 3 miles an hour, which is a pretty good clip, they're going to be at least walking for 2 to 2.5 hours. But for the rest of this journey, Jesus is breaking open the scriptures to them and referring to them all of the places where it says he would be crucified, that he would die, that he would rise again and return to them. Then they arrive at the end of their journey, and the daylight is beginning to dim, and they get the idea, it says, that their visitor is going to go on a little further. The understatement of all understatements, since actually Jesus is going to ascend to heaven and sit at the right hand of the Father, which we'll proclaim in just a few moments in our Nicene Creed. But nevertheless, they naturally don't have this understanding, so they invite him into the house where they've arrived at so that they can have supper together and he can have a place to stay before he journeys farther. A meal is prepared. We sort of get that idea. Jesus takes over. That should be a clue. And then when he breaks the bread and says some particular prayers, they suddenly recognize him. And in the moment of recognition, he vanishes from their midst. It's a pretty amazing sight. If you've never seen a man disappear, I haven't. In Las Vegas many years ago, I went to a Siegfried and Roy show where an elephant disappears at the very end. We know that that's some type of sleight of hand, of some type of thing they must do with mirrors of some sort. I'd already had 4 drinks at that point and thought maybe that's why that the elephant had vanished. But when something vanishes before your eyes, the idea is there's got to be some illusion, there's got to be some trickery, or perhaps a person would say, we've just imagined this entire thing. What an odd walk we've just done for 3 hours for the man who's vanished from our midst. Who would believe such a story, right? I mean, it's just hard to believe, isn't it? But you know what? Apparently what happens in Emmaus doesn't stay in Emmaus, because we're actually told these two men who have walked for 3 hours now hurry back to Jerusalem, even though it is dark. And they're going to rejoin the apostles, and well, you know what's going to happen. They're going to tell them about what just happened to them, and Jesus is going to appear again. Apparently, what happens in Jerusalem also does not stay in Jerusalem. What's really happening in this magnificent Easter story that we're hearing is a central principle of our faith is being illustrated without a specific description of that illustration. The term is called anamnesis, and anyone who has studied theology will know anamnesis is another word for remembering, or as I was taught at St. Meinrad, holy remembering, since it's frequently associated with some type of religious event. The phenomenon of memory is an interesting one to us because it all involves taking something in the past, hence we're remembering it, and actually bringing it forward to our consciousness in the immediate presence. For most of us, it's a very passive process. Who actually thinks in your head, I am in the act of remembering? I suppose if you could have seen us before this liturgy, trying to figure out how to make the sound work, as if we could somehow remember how to do it. There's some conversation was happening in our head, but trust me, in that process we were in the immediate present and we weren't thinking about anything in the past. But in the real work of remembering, something that has happened in the past is brought to our mind. And this was called anamnesis, that through this process, through the use of human memory, the past becomes present. What Jesus is illustrating in the resurrection is that he can be immediately present, even if he's not tangibly present in the way of those resurrection appearances. Note, each one of them are normally very short appearances. Emmaus is the longest one. They must be several hours. But the other stories seem to take place, they can be told when they're proclaimed within a minute or two. And so most of these appearances that Jesus makes with his apostles are very transitory. They're very brief. And in all of them, Jesus is appearing and disappearing and not using the conventional way of entering or exiting, so that we rather clearly understand something of divine origin is taking place. But even in this particular act, when Jesus appears, he doesn't appear as a memory, as something that happened in the past, but he's most certainly immediately present. Jesus knew this. He knew the genius of this, since he's the Son of God, and because he is God, he created the human mind, and he understands the human mind in a way you and I can never possibly understand it. And so he instituted his sacraments, all of them, to use as their primary vehicle anamnesis, or the process of remembering. The simple one is for most of us when we enter in church, when you can come back to one, and actually put our hands into the holy water font and make the sign of the cross. For many people, they wonder what it is that they're doing when they're doing that. That's anamnesis. We are remembering our baptism. Most of you are like me. We're baptized 2 or 3 weeks old, and we have no recollection of it whatsoever. And so the idea that we're remembering it seems rather odd to us. But I've seen the record, so I know that I was baptized in St. Anne's Church on the 18th of December, 1955, by Father Mickey Brennan. I decided this isn't all a product of a vast conspiracy, that it really is something that took place, even though there's no pictures of it, and I have no mental recollection of it. But every time that I make the sign of the cross, I am actually remembering our baptism. An event that was not available to me in the immediate moment comes instantly available to me with the sign of the cross. Of course, baptism is a one-time experience, but Eucharist, as I was taught in seminary, is the repeatable instance of our baptism. And so when we celebrate Eucharist, we engage in memory. Once again, we need the assistance of tangible presence. And so each sacrament contains with it matter and form, words and elements that immediately call to mind what's taking place. The bread and the wine that we will use this morning will become, by a process you and I could never understand, the sacred body and precious blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. And in that being Christ, you see, he is made present to us in communion. For those of you receiving communion spiritually as you are in your homes, now on the delayed process, since we weren't able to have a live broadcast this particular day, but that when we experience that moment at the Eucharist that will happen, what has happened in the past is made immediately and instantly and completely and exquisitely present to us. Anamnesis, holy remembering. And it is this centerpiece to our faith that allows us at Easter to not just simply view resurrection as a historical event that happened thousands of years ago with a handful of eyewitnesses. Historians can't even agree that there were any eyewitnesses, but we don't need that, because with the benefit of the scriptures to tell us the story, and with the benefit of the sacraments that were instituted by the Lord at the Last Supper, with the benefit of those sacraments, whatever happens in the past becomes immediately and beautifully present. And so it is when we remember. Maybe one of the most intimate forms of memory that we have is when we remember those who have died. And we all remember them, don't we? We remember those whose lives were influential to us, and perhaps whose deaths were challenges for us. As I preached on Easter Sunday, the death of my closest friend is still a major emotional challenge in my life. Even a quarter of a century later, the death of my parents in the last decade, similar to that. Many of you also, all of us have, as a common human experience, the grief that we experience, the separation that we experience, the mystery that we don't understand, what has become of our loved ones. And you see, it is through memory that we begin to access them. Often, though, if we don't think about it carefully, our memory is impoverished. We think we're simply recalling a past event. But you see, the mechanics of human memory are the same, whether they're celebrated in sacrament or they're celebrated as a sacramental, as we do when we remember our loved ones. You see, it isn't that we're recalling a past event of their existence. Almost all of us, when we recall someone that we love, there's something about them that we remember. There's a story that we associate with it. There's any number of different ways that that we bring that person to mind, and in the bringing of that loved person to mind, they become immediately present to us. In the same way that the sacrament is in the immediate presence, when we call to mind those that we love, they are available and present to us. They are as intimately next to us as they ever were in this life, and probably even more so. Catholics have a process of Mass intention, which is another way of trying to use that vehicle of anamnesis, or holy remembering, to bring a loved one to heart. This Sunday, we have 4 different intentions that we're celebrating in our one Mass that we're celebrating. Winnie Hayes and Jerry Dentinger, Kitty Langsworth, and Julia Fuller, along as our regular mention at one of our Masses for the deceased of St. Bridget and St. James Church. In saying their names out loud, which will happen in the general intercessions, and in publishing them as we always do in the bulletin, and when we do our preview for the liturgy that's happening, that you watch not live, but you watch online when you're watching it later, that this is also an act of holy remembering. We're bringing someone to the present. This is why we do it, but not as a past event, no longer available to us, but intimately and immediately present. One of the great singers of the late 20th century, George Michael himself, passed away a few years ago, but truly one of our most precious voices, suffered also a crippling emotional loss in the 1990s. And he was so crippled by his loss, he was unable to compose or sing for several years. And it, in fact, would be almost 4 years before he would record again. And the first song that he penned after such struggling with grief and the death and the paralysis that comes when you've been so hobbled by a significant death in your life is a song that's very precious to me, and if you've heard it, it would be precious to you also. The name of it is Jesus to a Child. It's one of his singles that's easily accessible. YouTube can get it for you right in a minute. The song is all about how he is bringing the memory of someone that he has loved present to his mind. But there's an exquisite verse towards the end of the song that's a personal favorite of mine. It says towards the end of the song, for every single memory has become a part of me. You see, that's what happens when we remember. That it's not just simply this past event that we call to our mind. That's way too abstract. The memories of our loved ones have become integrated with our consciousness, which means they have become a part of me. Our loved ones are fully immersed in our memory. They're so present that we almost miss how so present they are, in a way that they're not quite so present when they're living in tangible bodies the way that we see them. Holy memory is not a substitute for the real thing. Holy memory is actually the real thing, and it's what God promises us. The people that we remember in this very sacred way that we hold in our mind are, if you allow me the expression, waiting to see us again. I've been reading about end-of-life experiences, and one of those is the commonality of those end-of-life experiences, having been in hospital rooms, although not recently, but often in my ministry, I've certainly seen the phenomenon and saw it with my own parents, where people see persons who have died and they say their names out loud, and you think there must be the drugs they're taking, or that the sedation that they're experiencing, or that they've lost their mind. You know, the way we would sometimes think of something like that. But I've witnessed it often enough that I no longer can think this is just simply something that's happened to this person, that we're actually seeing something, that they see something that we cannot see. In the reading I've been doing, though, that's something I hadn't noticed before, is that a common experience is that persons who are in the act of dying also witness what they say is a crowded room, a room full of people. I don't mean the people in the hospital room. Those are frequently crowded, but not always. No, this is much more metaphoric. They're actually seeing something else. They are seeing the people who are ready to greet them. And their process, while it is excruciatingly painful for us to witness and to think about, is anything but awful, is anything but sad, isn't anything but terrifying, but it must be the most incredible, wonderful sensation we can possibly imagine. A room full of people who we have missed, that are suddenly, intimately, and tangibly present, and they'll never be separated again. When I preach at funerals, I often speak of remembering as the way that we grieve. And the grieving, while it is a difficult process for all of us, grieving transforms itself into anamnesis, holy memory. Through grieving, which we learn to manage a little bit better as the months and the years go by, our loved ones become present to us, and we're reminded that we're not separated from them. In fact, their experience is so intimately present that they are literally in our mind. This was God's plan when he celebrated and instituted the Eucharist. The Mass that we celebrate this morning always has the same ending. In fact, one of the things that we have to do as clerics is try to encourage people to not leave after Holy Communion. I always say when we're talking about when more people are in the church, please don't do that. Even when you see other people do that, there's never a good reason to leave before the Mass is ended. The Mass always ends with a dismissal, which is a blessing. To the naked eye, to the untrained eye, it's a wave of a hand, it's a few words, may God bless you, and there's some bulletin announcements, and somebody wonders, what's the purpose of all of that? But you see, the blessing is actually God's blessing. It's simply imparted through those waving hands of the priest, and it's God who is commissioning every one of us who's celebrating that Eucharist to do something. And here's the something. He is saying what happens at Mass does not stay at Mass. You see, we're to be changed by what happens here. We're to actually walk out of these doors, or the doors of your own sheltered existence where you're at right now, and commit ourselves to making this world a better place. We will still be hobbled with suffering. We will still have the difficulty of the pandemic. All of us struggle with the loss of our loved ones, and what does it mean for us? And we live in a world with so many vexing problems, and yet the Eucharist is a reminder to us that we can be a witness to others, like the two apostles on the road to Emmaus, that Jesus appears alongside us even though we don't recognize him, and his presence is so instantly tangible. The words that they say to each other later should be our words as well. Were not our hearts burning within us when he walked with us along the way? The great message of Easter is that Jesus did not rise, leave, never to return again. Jesus is indeed risen, but he will never leave again. And his presence is so immediate, as are all those we mourn and miss. And they're waiting in that, shall I say, crowded room for the moment of God's choosing when we are invited to join their number. This isn't a sadness. This isn't something to fear. This isn't something to be the source of our anxiety. This is, in fact, the essence of all joy, Easter joy.